Tonight, let your thoughts settle like soft dust floating through the quiet halls of an ancient cathedral, because we are drifting into one of the most gentle, tragic, and deeply human stories ever written, a story born from stone, from shadow, and from the quiet echo of a bell tower that has watched centuries pass beneath it. Imagine Paris, long before the city became a place of bright cafes and crowded boulevards. Imagine a Paris still wrapped in medieval nights, where the streets were narrow, the rooftops uneven, and the only thing taller than the dreams of its people was the silhouette of the great Notre-Dame rising like a mountain of carved stone. High above that city, in a place where the wind hums through Gothic arches and pigeons drift like spirits between spires, lived someone almost forgotten by the world below, a figure shaped by fate, misunderstood by the times he was born into, yet filled with a tenderness no one expected. Quasimodo, not the monster the crowds imagined, but the lonely guardian of a cathedral that seemed to understand him better than any human voice ever had. Tonight, we will step quietly into his world, not to judge, not to analyze harshly, but simply to listen to the softness hidden beneath the story, to the heartbeat that Victor Hugo carved into his pages. We will wander through the corridors of Notre-Dame, trace the worn grooves on its bells where his hands once clung, and follow the echoes of a life spent in the shadows yet glowing with an inner light. This is not a tale of horror. It is a tale of how beauty can live inside places the world refuses to look. A tale of how compassion can survive even in a world ruled by fear and superstition. A tale of a man who could not straighten his back, but whose loyalty and love stood taller than any tower in Paris. So allow yourself to drift gently into the story. Let the world slow its pace. Let the faint, imagined toll of a cathedral bell ring softly in your thoughts, each note stretching out into the evening like a calm breath. Tonight, we will meet Quasimodo again, not as a creature, not as an outcast, but as the silent soul of Notre-Dame, the boy who grew into an echo, the echo that grew into a legend, and the legend that still whispers through the stone of Paris whenever the city becomes quiet enough to hear it. Take a deep breath, and let us begin. Chapter 1. Notre-Dame, the breath of stone. Before we step into Quasimodo's life, we must first step into the life of a building, because Notre-Dame is not merely a place where this story happens. It is a character of its own, older, wiser, and more patient than any person who has ever walked beneath its shadow. Tonight, imagine Paris in the late Middle Ages. The air holds the faint scent of wood smoke. Lanterns glow dimly in narrow streets. Above it all, Notre-Dame rises from Ile de la Cité like a living mountain of stone. Its walls breathe with centuries of prayers, footsteps, secrets, and silent hopes left behind by thousands of souls who sought refuge inside. The cathedral was still young in Quasimodo's time, just a few hundred years old, yet already it had witnessed the coronation of kings, the fall of dynasties, and crowds searching for miracles. Every part of its architecture speaks a language carved not with words but with patience. The pointed arches like hands reaching skyward, the stained glass windows shimmering with stories of light, the gargoyles perched like guardians watching the city from above. And at the heart of this vast cathedral, hidden between timber beams and the vaulted ceiling, lived the bells. Huge, bronze, ancient. Their voices could fill the entire city, announcing joy, sorrow, danger, or celebration. Each had its own tone, its own vibration, its own personality, and in time, they would become the only true companions Quasimodo ever had. But before he rang them, before he climbed the towers, before he became the shadow of Notre-Dame, there was a quieter truth. The cathedral itself was waiting for him. It had space for the lonely. It had patience for the misunderstood. It had silence for those who had no voice in the world below. Notre-Dame, in the story Victor Hugo created, is a sanctuary not just for worship, but for anyone who does not belong anywhere else. As you listen tonight, let the cathedral become more than stone. Imagine standing in the cool darkness of its nave. The air is heavy with the scent of incense. The faint light from candles shimmers across carved pillars that look like forest trunks turned to rock. Your footsteps echo softly across the ancient floor. Up above, in places no visitor ever sees, the quiet wind hums against the arches. And in that wind, if you listen closely, you might hear the faintest memory of a boy who grew up here among the bells. A boy who saw the world from above, yet belonged to none of it. This is the beginning of his world. A world where the walls remember, where silence becomes a language, and where a cathedral breathes with the life of those who have been forgotten. Tonight, Notre-Dame becomes our doorway. Let us step through it gently. Chapter 2. The Abandoned Child of Paris. Long before he became the bell ringer of Notre-Dame, Quasimodo was simply a child, fragile, strange-looking, and left alone in a world that did not know what to do with those who were different. The streets of Paris in the 15th century were harsh. Poverty was common, disease spread often, and superstition filled the minds of even the wisest people. Anything unusual was feared, anything unfamiliar was whispered about. And so, when a baby was found at the steps of Notre-Dame twisted in form, with a curved spine and a face the world was not prepared to love, people recoiled. But the cathedral did not. Inside those stone walls, no one was judged by appearance. It was here that Archdeacon Claude Frollo found the child. Frollo, a man torn between compassion and the weight of his own rigid beliefs, could not bring himself to abandon the infant. So he took the boy in, named him Quasimodo, meaning almost formed, and raised him within Notre-Dame. But even under the cathedral's roof, life was quiet and lonely. Quasimodo grew up hearing whispers whenever he passed. He felt the shrinking of bodies avoiding him. He saw the fear in their eyes. Over time, the world's rejection shaped him. He stopped trying to be seen. He stopped hoping to be liked. He learned to move through corridors silently, as if trying to occupy as little space in the world as possible. And yet, the boy's heart was soft. He would watch children playing in the square below, wishing just for a moment to join them. He would trace the carvings on the cathedral's pillars, imagining stories in the stone. He developed a deep affection for the bells, whose mighty voices never judged him, never recoiled, never questioned why he was different. The bells became his friends. Their vibrations against his chest felt like a heartbeat he could understand. Their songs felt like conversations in a language only he and the cathedral shared. Still, loneliness wrapped around him like a cloak, but it was a loneliness without bitterness, just a deep, quiet yearning to be part of something, even if he didn't know what that something was. In the stillness of Notre-Dame, Quasimodo grew into a young man with a gentle spirit hidden behind a body the world refused to accept. He learned compassion without ever receiving it. He learned loyalty without anyone earning it. And he learned to love the cathedral with the kind of devotion only someone who has been saved by stone could feel. But his story did not begin with triumph. It began with abandonment. And yet, even in that beginning, a seed of tenderness was quietly growing, waiting for the moment it could bloom. Chapter 3. Keeper of the Bells. By the time Quasimodo reached adulthood, he had become inseparable from the bells of Notre-Dame. They were no longer objects to him, they were companions, memories, and emotions all woven into sound. Every morning before Paris awoke, he climbed the narrow spiral staircases, his hands brushing the cold stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Up in the towers, the wind carried the scent of the river, the chimneys, the bread ovens warming up across the city. And there, surrounded by bronze giants, Quasimodo felt more understood than anywhere else in the world. When he rang the bells, he did not simply pull ropes. He embraced them, leaned into them, let their deep vibrations travel through his bones. As the bells sang, he felt alive. He felt powerful. He felt, perhaps for the only time in his life, beautiful. But the bells also took something from him. Their thunderous voices, so close to his ears, slowly stole his hearing. Quasimodo grew deaf not through misfortune, but through devotion. Yet even in silence, he understood the bells better than anyone. He could feel their tones through the floor, through the beams, through the air itself. The world below saw a hunchback. Notre-Dame saw its guardian. In the quiet moments between tolls, Quasimodo would sit on the ledge of the North Tower and watch Paris unfold like a living tapestry. The rooftops glittered in the sun. Boats floated along the Seine like drifting thoughts. Children played, merchants haggled, lovers whispered in alleyways where the city forgot to age. To him, Paris looked peaceful from up high. Only when he descended did he remember that people could be cruel. But up in the towers, he was weightless, free. He belonged to the height, to the wind, to the singing metal that shook the sky. He was the keeper of the bells, and the bells, in their own way, were keepers of him. In those towering chambers of wood and bronze, Quasimodo forged the quietest yet strongest bond of his life. A bond that would carry him through both love and heartbreak. A bond that would give him courage when the world turned its back. And a bond that would echo, centuries later, as the symbol of a man who was never monstrous, only misunderstood. Chapter 4. Claude Frollo. The shadow beside the light. In stories like this, people often say Quasimodo lived alone, that he had no one, that his world consisted only of bells and stone. But the truth, as Victor Hugo quietly revealed, is more complicated, because alongside Quasimodo, there was another presence, one shaped by brilliance and darkness, compassion and obsession, kindness and cruelty. His name was Claude Frollo. To understand Quasimodo's life, we must drift gently into the mind of the man who raised him, not to judge him, but to observe him with the same softness we bring to everything in this story. Claude Frollo was not born a villain. He was born a seeker of knowledge, a scholar who spent long nights hunched over books, tracing Latin texts by candlelight in a quiet corner of the cathedral. Paris knew him as a prodigy. The church knew him as a rising star. But Frollo knew himself as someone eternally searching for answers to questions that felt older than the city itself. His intellect was sharp, but his heart carried wounds he never learned to heal. As a young man, he lost both his parents to the plague, and suddenly the world felt fragile, unpredictable, and painfully temporary. He sought refuge in the only place that had not collapsed around him, Notre-Dame. Its stone walls promised permanence, order, and an unchanging truth that he clung to desperately. So when he found a deformed baby abandoned on the cathedral steps, something quiet shifted in him. Perhaps he saw in the child a reflection of his own loneliness. Perhaps he saw redemption, or perhaps he simply could not bear another form of abandonment. He adopted the child and named him Quasimodo, not out of cruelty, but out of the clinical language of a scholar unable to fully separate intellect from emotion. But even kindness, when mixed with fear and rigidity, becomes something warped. As Quasimodo grew older, Frollo's affection grew colder. He began to fear what the world might think of his adopted son. He worried that the child was a sign not of compassion, but of sin. His studies in alchemy, astronomy, and forbidden texts filled him with contradictions. And those contradictions, unresolved, twisted slowly inward. Quasimodo felt it. He sensed the tension in Frollo's voice, the flicker of disappointment in his gaze, the weight of expectations he could never meet. Still, Quasimodo loved him. He loved the man who saved him, the man who named him, the man who, for a time, was his entire world. Frollo, in his own conflicted way, loved Quasimodo too, but love built on fear becomes a cage. And Quasimodo, quietly and unknowingly, grew into a prisoner of a devotion he never asked for. The bells were freedom, Frollo was duty, Notre-Dame was home, and the delicate balance of those three forces would soon be shaken by a single presence, a presence as unexpected as a ray of sunlight breaking through a stained glass window. But before she arrives in this story, we must understand Frollo fully, because his heart, perhaps more than anyone else's, would shape the path Quasimodo would walk. a heart trapped between shadow and light. Chapter 5. The Festival of Fools. If Notre-Dame was a world of stillness, then the Festival of Fools was a world of noise. A day when Paris turned upside down, when the poor dressed like kings, when rules bent into laughter, when music filled the streets, and when everyone, for one brief moment, forgot their burdens. For Quasimodo, the festival was a distant sound, something he observed from high above, like watching a firework from behind a window. The bells were his life, and the towers were his shelter. Crowds scared him, attention terrified him, and the idea of descending into the streets felt like stepping into a world not meant for him. But Frollo insisted. He ordered Quasimodo to leave the towers and watch the festival from the crowd, hoping perhaps foolishly that the world might accept his adopted son, or that Quasimodo might learn humility, or that fate would shift in some way neither of them could predict. So Quasimodo obeyed. Down the winding stairs, through the cathedral courtyard, into the sea of people where laughter mixed with drunken singing. Almost immediately, the crowd noticed him. At first, they stared, then they whispered, then, in a cruel twist of irony, they cheered. For this was the day the crowd chose their Pope of Fools, the person with the most exaggerated face, the most distorted appearance, the most shocking features. Quasimodo, who never wished to be seen at all, suddenly became the center of everything. They lifted him onto a makeshift throne, placed a crooked crown on his head, marched him through the streets as their mascot of mockery. Their laughter was loud, but to Quasimodo, now nearly deaf, it sounded like a distant storm, muffled and confusing. He felt their touches, their rough hands pulling him, their jeers vibrating through his bones, far more than he could hear them. He did not understand what he had done wrong. He did not understand why they were laughing. He did not understand why the world he had only ever watched from afar now felt like it was swallowing him whole. For the first time, he wished he were back in the towers alone, safe, unseen. The festival, meant to be joyous, became a day Quasimodo would remember with a quiet ache for the rest of his life. But fate is strange, because even in moments of cruelty, sometimes threads of light appear, and in the midst of mocking faces, someone stepped toward him, not to laugh, not to jeer, but to offer a kindness he had never received from a stranger, a kindness that would change everything. Chapter 6. The first glance of Esmeralda. Her presence arrived like warmth, drifting into a cold room. Esmeralda, a name Paris whispered with fascination, a dancer whose movements felt like poetry swirling through the air, a spirit both gentle and fierce, with eyes that carried entire stories behind them. To the crowds, she was entertainment. To the city guards, she was trouble. To poets, she was inspiration. But to Quasimodo, she would become something he had never known, a mirror reflecting his humanity back at him. During the Festival of Fools, as the crowd turned cruel, Esmeralda stepped forward. She moved through the sea of jeering faces, with a bravery that seemed too large for her small frame. She approached Quasimodo, this trembling, confused, half-deaf young man, trapped in a storm he did not understand, and she did something no one had ever done before. She showed him kindness. She touched his arm gently, as if to steady him. She tried to shield him from the worst of the crowd. She looked at him, not at his deformities, not at his hunched back, not at the rumors whispered about him, but at him. For someone who had lived his entire life being avoided, feared, or stared at from afar, this single moment felt like a miracle. Quasimodo's heart, unused to softness, thudded unevenly. He lowered his head, not out of shame, but out of fear that he might break the moment, simply by existing. Esmeralda didn't pity him. She didn't mock him. She didn't treat him as less than human. She treated him as someone who deserved compassion. In that instant, something quiet and powerful awakened in Quasimodo, a fragile hope, blooming like a flower in an unexpected crack of stone. He did not yet understand it. He did not yet name it, but he felt it. Someone had finally seen him. Not the bell ringer, not the hunchback, not the outcast. Him. One glance, and the world he knew shifted slightly, like a great bell beginning to swing for the first time, gathering momentum for a sound that would echo far into his future. Esmeralda smiled softly before disappearing back into the crowd, unaware that she had just changed the course of two lives, his and hers. From the towers of Notre-Dame to the heart of a misunderstood man, her kindness would echo louder than any bell he ever rang. And the story, from this moment onward, would never be the same. Chapter 7. The Quiet Blossoming of an Impossible Heart. In the days following the Festival of Fools, something changed inside Quasimodo, a change so subtle, so fragile, that even he did not fully understand it. But it was there, lingering like the faint warmth a candle leaves behind even after its flame has gone out. He thought of Esmeralda often, not obsessively, not possessively, but with a gentle curiosity, as if replaying a moment he feared he might forget. He remembered her touch, the first soft touch he had ever known. He remembered the calm in her eyes while the world mocked him. He remembered her bravery, her defiance, her compassion. In the quiet upper chambers of the bell towers, he would sit beside the giant bronze bells, running his fingers along their cool surfaces as if trying to steady the emotions inside him. The bells had always been his companions, but now, they seemed to ring differently, fuller, deeper, holding a tone that carried something new in their vibrations. Hope, a small, trembling hope. Every evening, he climbed out onto the parapets and looked toward the edges of Paris, where Esmeralda sometimes performed in public squares. He could not hear her music, the bells had taken his hearing long ago, but he imagined it, soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat carried on the wind. He knew he could never be part of her world. He knew she lived among colors, dancing, laughter, movement, everything vibrant and alive, while he lived in shadows, silence, stone, and solitude. But he did not long for her love. He longed for her goodness, for the way she saw him in a way the world never had. To Quasimodo, Esmeralda was not a dream. She was a glimpse of what humanity could be. Meanwhile, Frollo noticed the shift in him. The moments when Quasimodo seemed distracted, the way he paused at windows, staring toward the city below. The softness in his expression. Frollo, already a cloud of contradictions, felt something new, an unease tightening around him. He sensed the beginnings of a story he could not control, and fear, for a man like him, always twisted into darker shapes. But Quasimodo did not see this. He only felt the faint stirrings of a heart beginning to bloom in a place where it had never been watered before. Tonight, as we follow him through candle-lit corridors and moonlit rooftops, we don't see a monster. We see a young man discovering that kindness, even if given only once, can echo for an entire lifetime. And this echo was about to guide him down a path that would change the fate of everyone in the story. Chapter 8. Frollo's Descent into the Dark. While Quasimodo's heart opened quietly, Claude Frollo's heart began to close. Esmeralda's presence had awakened something in him as well, but not tenderness, not hope. Instead, it awakened the shadows he had tried so hard to bury beneath his scholarship and religion. He had long believed himself immune to worldly temptations. He studied alchemy instead of romance. He memorized scripture instead of songs. He held tightly to discipline, to order, to control. But Esmeralda disrupted all of that. Her laughter was a language he did not know how to process. Her freedom contradicted everything he had built his identity upon. Her beauty, natural, effortless, uncontained, challenged the rigid walls he had constructed around his emotions. And because he did not know how to understand her, he feared her. Fear twisted into fascination. Fascination twisted into obsession. Obsession twisted into something darker, something he could not name but felt consuming him like a slow fire. Frollo, terrified of his own desires, sought to blame anything but himself. He blamed fate. He blamed temptation. He even blamed the devil. But he did not blame the one person who needed to be confronted: himself. In his confusion, Quasimodo became both a comfort and a reminder of his failures. A comfort because Quasimodo depended on him. A reminder because Quasimodo had received compassion from Esmeralda, something Frollo believed should have belonged to him if he had allowed himself to be human. And so, with each passing day, Frollo slipped further into a quiet spiral. His footsteps grew louder in the cathedral halls. His prayers grew harsher. His gaze grew sharper, as if trying to pierce the very air Esmeralda breathed. The gentle scholar he once was began to disappear beneath layers of fear, guilt, desire, and denial. He convinced himself that the world was testing him. He convinced himself that Esmeralda was a threat. He convinced himself that he alone must take control. In this growing darkness, Quasimodo saw only fragments. A tension in Frollo's voice, a small tremor in his hands, a strange intensity in his eyes. But Quasimodo, loyal and trusting, never questioned him. To him, Frollo was the man who saved his life, the man he owed everything to, the man he believed would never lead him astray. He did not yet know that love and fear were shifting inside Frollo like two tides crashing against each other. And soon, their collision would bring storm clouds over the quiet rhythm of his simple, peaceful life. Chapter 9. The attempted kidnapping and the shattering of innocence. It happened on a night when Paris was unusually quiet. A night when mist rolled through the streets like drifting spirits, softening lantern light and muting distant voices. A night that felt calm but carried a tension that Quasimodo could sense, even without hearing. Frollo came to him with an order, a simple command, spoken in a tone cold enough to unsettle the young man who adored him. "Bring her to me." Quasimodo did not understand. He did not question. He simply obeyed, as he always had, trusting the man who raised him. Under Frollo's shadowed guidance, he descended into the city at night, moving through alleyways with a mixture of uncertainty and dread. His heart pounded not from malice, but from confusion. He only wanted to protect Esmeralda, to help her, to understand why Frollo seemed so shaken by her. When he found Esmeralda walking alone, carrying her small goat and humming softly to herself, he approached slowly, unsure of how to speak to her. But before he could gather courage, Frollo's whisper, sharp as a blade, cut through the air behind him. "Take her." Quasimodo reached out, not with violence, but with the hesitation of someone torn between two loyalties, one to the man who raised him, and one to the woman who had shown him kindness. Esmeralda, startled and frightened, screamed. The guards arrived within moments, torches blazing, swords drawn. They seized Quasimodo, mistaking him for a predator. He tried to explain, but his deafness twisted his words into sounds the crowd could not understand. He tried to resist, but the fear in Esmeralda's eyes broke him more deeply than any blade could. He did not realize that the true instigator Frollo had already slipped into the shadows, unseen. The guards dragged Quasimodo through the streets. The mob jeered. Stones and insults struck him from every side. And for the first time since he was a child, Quasimodo felt truly helpless, not because of his body, but because he had been used by the one person he trusted most. Esmeralda watched silently as they took him away. Part of her feared him. Part of her pitied him. Part of her wondered why his eyes had looked so unbearably confused, almost pleading. Days later, Quasimodo stood trial. He was sentenced to the pillory, exposed before the public as punishment. And in the merciless sunlight, the crowd gathered to mock him again. This was the moment when innocence shattered. The world that Quasimodo had once watched from afar, so full of color and laughter, revealed its crueler side. And as he suffered beneath the weight of public humiliation, something inside him began to change. But just as despair threatened to drown him, someone stepped forward again. Esmeralda, with a simple gesture, the offering of water to a man dying of thirst, she restored a piece of his humanity the world had tried to erase. And in that moment, Quasimodo understood two truths that would guide the rest of his life. Frollo had betrayed him. Esmeralda had saved him. One act of cruelty. One act of compassion. Two paths splitting the heart of a man who had never asked for anything but to exist in peace. Chapter 10. The Sanctuary Within the Stone. After the pillory, after the jeering crowds, after the unbearable thirst and the searing humiliation, Quasimodo's world changed forever. Not because of the pain, not because of the punishment, but because one person, one single person stepped forward when everyone else stepped back. Esmeralda. Her simple act of offering him water that day became a light in the deepest corner of his memory. For someone who had lived a lifetime without kindness, the gesture did not simply comfort him, it rewrote his understanding of humanity. And so, when fate turned sharply and Esmeralda found herself in danger, accused of a crime she did not commit, Quasimodo could feel the echo of her compassion calling to him, not as a duty, not as a debt, but as a truth his heart could no longer ignore. The day came when she was about to be taken by force, dragged from the cathedral steps by soldiers determined to carry out her execution. And in that moment, Quasimodo emerged from the shadows of Notre-Dame, with a strength born not of anger, but of devotion. He swept Esmeralda into his arms, lifted her high above the crowd, and carried her into the cathedral. His voice, usually quiet, harsh, strain, tore through the air with a force no one had ever heard from him. Sanctuary. The word rang like thunder. It startled the soldiers. It froze the crowd. And it marked the moment Quasimodo claimed something for the first time in his life. The right to protect the one person who had seen him, even briefly, as human. Inside the cathedral, the world grew still again. The air smelled of candle wax and old stone. The distant echo of footsteps faded into silence. And in the upper levels of Notre-Dame, surrounded by beams and bells, Quasimodo gently set Esmeralda down in a small refuge he had prepared for her. He brought her water, food, blankets, anything he could find. He watched her with the devotion of someone who finally had a purpose, not because she belonged to him, but because she mattered to him. Esmeralda, frightened and exhausted, did not fully understand him yet. His movements were strange, his expressions unfamiliar. His world of silence and stone was unlike anything she had known, but she could feel the sincerity radiating from him like warmth from a fire. He meant her no harm. He wanted nothing in return. He simply wanted her to live. In the quiet days that followed, an unlikely bond took shape, not of romance, but of something gentler, something quieter, like two souls recognizing each other across a chasm of loneliness. Esmeralda had given him compassion. Now Quasimodo gave her sanctuary, and Notre-Dame, the great cathedral that had sheltered him all his life, opened its arms to her as well, protecting them both beneath its vast and ancient heart. Chapter 11. A love that never asked to be returned. The days Esmeralda spent in sanctuary were a soft, fragile chapter in Quasimodo's life, a moment when everything felt almost peaceful, almost hopeful, almost like the world might finally allow him a small corner of happiness. He watched over her quietly, always from a respectful distance. In the mornings, he left small offerings by her door, a bowl of fruit, a loaf of bread, a cup of clean water. In the afternoons, he guided her through secret passages of the cathedral, showing her hidden nooks where sunlight filtered through stained glass in colors that felt like whispered prayer. And at night, he sat near the window, watching the stars above Paris as if guarding her dreams. He loved her, but his love was not possessive. It was not demanding. It was not hungry or tangled or aggressive like the love swelling inside Frollo. Quasimodo's love was a quiet devotion, the kind that simply wished for her to be safe, even if she never returned his feelings. When Esmeralda spoke, he listened without needing to hear. He watched the movement of her lips, the expressions on her face, and he understood her not through sound, but through presence. For Esmeralda, Quasimodo was not a lover, nor was he frightening. He was a protector, gentle, loyal, and pure of heart. A soul shaped by suffering but softened by kindness. She cared for him too, but in a different way. She saw him as a friend, as someone who deserved compassion, as someone whose heart was far more beautiful than the world allowed itself to see. Meanwhile, Frollo's obsession grew like a shadow stretching across all their lives. He watched from hidden corners. He studied their interactions. He convinced himself that their connection was a threat, not to Esmeralda's safety, but to his control. In his twisted logic, if he could not possess her, no one could. Not even Quasimodo, whose love was the purest thing he had ever witnessed. In this contrast, Quasimodo's gentle devotion and Frollo's violent obsession, the story revealed one of its deepest truths. Love, in its purest form, seeks to protect. In its darkest form, it seeks to control. Esmeralda sensed the danger closing in, but she did not know from where. Quasimodo, loyal to Frollo, did not yet see the threat fully. And Frollo, consumed by fear and desire, was preparing to make a decision that would alter their lives forever. Sanctuary could hide Esmeralda from the world, but it could not hide her from fate. Chapter 12. The Last Toll of the Bells. Night fell softly on Paris, a night thick with tension, wind, and the quiet murmur of fate. In the shadows outside Notre-Dame, Claude Frollo moved like a figure carved out of darkness. His obsession had reached its breaking point. He no longer saw Esmeralda as a person, but as a temptation he needed to either possess or destroy. Inside the cathedral, Quasimodo slept lightly in the upper tower, exhausted from days of guarding Esmeralda. He did not sense the creeping danger. He did not hear the footsteps on the stone floor below. Frollo acted quickly. With the help of the soldiers who believed Esmeralda must be captured, he dragged her from sanctuary under the cover of darkness. She screamed for help, her voice echoing through the cathedral like a cry swallowed by centuries of stone. Quasimodo awoke instantly, not from the sound but from the absence of Esmeralda's presence. As if a thread connecting their spirits had been suddenly snapped, he rushed down the stairs, leaping past beams and stone steps, his heart pounding with a panic he had never felt before. But he was too late. By the time he reached the courtyard, the soldiers had taken her away, and Frollo stood at a distance, silent, rigid, watching the scene with a hollow expression. The next morning, the city gathered again, this time not for a festival, but for an execution. Esmeralda stood on the scaffold, frail, trembling, yet filled with a quiet courage. She looked out at the crowd, searching for a face, any face that might save her. And Quasimodo, perched high on the towers of Notre-Dame, saw her loneliness, saw her fear, saw the injustice unfolding before him, and something inside him broke not his heart, but the silence he had lived in all his life. The bells, sensing his anguish, stood waiting. Quasimodo grabbed the rope of the largest bell, the great Emmanuel, and pulled with all the strength in his body. The bell roared to life. Its cry shook the towers. Its vibration rolled across Paris like a wave of thunder. Its voice screamed the pain. Quasimodo could not speak. The city froze. Soldiers turned. The crowd gasped. Quasimodo climbed down the facade of the cathedral, a silhouette against the sky, moving with a desperate strength born only in moments of love or loss. He reached Esmeralda, held her in his arms, lifted her away from the scaffold. But this time, there was no sanctuary left to run to. Not in stone, not in faith, not in the fragile world that had never truly protected either of them. The story of Quasimodo and Esmeralda ends quietly, not with triumph, but with a sorrowful tenderness that lingers like the final echo of a bell after its last toll. Quasimodo would lay Esmeralda to rest with the devotion of someone who loved beyond his limits, someone who knew that even a brief moment of kindness could fill a lifetime of solitude. And Notre-Dame, silent and ancient, would carry their memory in its stones, a reminder that love, no matter how impossible, can illuminate even the darkest corners of the human heart.